I know my own, and my own know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father. This is huge. In the time that Jesus was saying these words, God was unknowable. God's commandments were known. God's covenant was known. God's faithfulness to the people of Israel, that was known. But there was no such thing as a relationship or a personal relationship with God. God was unknowable. God was mystery. Even the name of God was not to be given voice to, because the divine name is understood to be too sacred to be uttered. While God was transcendental and otherworldly for the Jewish people, it was also incredibly important that God had selected to have the symbol of God's presence with God's chosen people to reside in the temple in Jerusalem. And so even with the temple, where God's presence resided in the innermost room, in the Holy of Holies, where only the high priest was allowed to enter in to make sacrifices and to say prayers on behalf of all the people. And in the architecture of that temple and the design of that temple where God resided with God's people, there were so many layers, keeping people further and further removed from the Holy of Holies. The court of the Gentiles was on the outside, outermost edge, and that's where anyone could enter in. And then there was the court of women, and then there was the hall of the Israelites, and then the hall of the priests, before you even got to the outer room before the Holy of Holies. This design only amplified the sense of being so far removed from God, to not feel known by God, perhaps even to feel inconsequential to God. And so these words that Jesus offers to his followers about knowing his own and his own knowing him, in the same way that Jesus is known by God the Creator and God is known by Jesus, this would have been mind-blowing, a radical shift in terms of understanding God. We know Jesus. We know him as a teacher, as a healer, as one who looked with compassion, who strove for justice, who sought to know and love the suffering and the lonely and the sick and the destitute. And Jesus tells us that this knowing goes both ways, that we know Jesus and that we ourselves are known by God. And how are we known by God? We are known by God becoming human, knowing as fully and as deeply and as intimately as possible what it is to be human. God seeks to know us as fully as we can possibly be known. So what does this mean for us? It means that we know the love of God. And we know that love because we experience it. We believe it. We see it in the choices that Jesus made to invite all those on the margins, outside of the society, and bring them right smack dab into the middle. We know it because Jesus continued to challenge authority and power and to respond with justice and with love. Because in Jesus we saw that God who was willing to be known to us, just like a shepherd knows the sheep. The good shepherd knows their rhythms. Which sheep will wander? Which sheep will be distracted by a blade of grass and miss the movement of the herd? Which will stay close? And which sheep are more comfortable on the edges? The shepherd knows the sheep, and the sheep know the shepherd. And that being known and fully accepted and cherished even, along with holding within us a sense of being unequivocally assured of the love of God for us, that then liberates us to respond to that love. And we respond to God's love by turning towards God's beloved creation, to each other and the world around us with love. The writer of 1 John lays this out for us. We know love by this, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for one another. How does God's love abide in anyone who has the world's goods and sees a brother or sister in need and yet refuses to help? Little children, let us love, not in word or speech, but in truth and action. The experience of such a love as God's love for us compels us to respond, not only to God, but to the community and the world that God has created. This is not some idyllic, skipping through meadows with rainbows and unicorns type of love, but is more gritty, feet to the pavement, eyes wide open love that requires us to give of ourselves for one another, speaking truth, taking a stance, walking the walk. And I believe that there is a desire in each of us to do just that. But one of the issues that we struggle with in our current context, in our current day and age, is isolation. In various ways, we experience isolation. Socially, as we leave communication to occur through emails and texts, both of which leave out the subtle nuance of voice intonation and expression, which communicates so much more than mere words on a screen. And we miss out on the chance for the brain to connect the sound of someone's voice with the pleasant sensation of communicating and connecting with them. And we have isolation even from creation. There are a myriad of examples, but I will go into one that connects us with many biblical stories. When we are thirsty, we walk over to the sink and turn on a faucet and fill a glass with water without even thinking about how that life-sustaining element came to be in that glass. We don't have to dig a well or lower a bucket to draw water up. We don't have to carry enough in a basin on our heads to provide for our household for the morning. We don't have to think about what pollutants have tainted the water and whether it will make us sick. There is a water plant that purifies it for us. We simply turn the handle and water comes pouring out. We don't have to think about it. We aren't connected to it. And this isolation from one another and from creation can cause us not to be mindful of these basic needs that we have as human beings. And we remain disconnected to the resources that God has provided to fill those needs. We need vitamin D for our bodies, and we turn toward the sun to fill us with that vitamin. God provides for us. These needs draw us into relationship with all of creation and the whole natural order of interconnection that calls us to one another and connects us with our Creator. My niece recently did the 23andMe genetic testing, DNA testing. It sounds fairly simple. Probably several of you know more about it than I do. But as I understand it, you take a swab and rub it on the inside of your cheek and send off a sample to the lab, which tests it, and in a few weeks you get the results, which shows you the percentage of DNA you carry from various parts of the world. My niece was somewhat surprised at the results. While the majority of her genes are from Europe, which was not terribly surprising, what surprised her was she has connections in many more regions of the world than we would have expected. It's pretty amazing. They send you this, or give you a link to this grayscale map, and then they color in bright colors all the different regions that show up in your DNA. And so you open it up, and there's this brightly colored map showing you all over the world where your DNA is from. We are connected in more ways than we allow ourselves to believe that we are. And so we need to continue to stretch and move outside of our isolation and move beyond the world that we see right in front of us and strive to know one another and our world more fully, more completely. Because in seeking to know one another, we will come to know God and possibly even ourselves more fully. So as we go out those doors this morning, let us strive to know one another more fully so we may see and know the beautiful variety of God's creation, and may grow more completely into the fullness of grace and love for which we were made. Amen.